Hey, everybody. I'd like to welcome Elisa Delapaz to the podcast. And Elisa, what we do here is pretty straightforward, which is to discuss how the outer circumstances of our lives stimulate our inner experience in two very distinct ways. One is through the separate psychological ego that use that term because I'm a therapist, right, and studied psychology. And the second is through the divine soul connection to all that is. So, why do I think it's important to know the difference? Well, this is where you come in as our guest to help us relate to this inner conflict that I see within my clients and often within myself, and give us some ideas on how to integrate these two perspectives into one full, beautiful human experience. So, thanks so much for being here, and jump on in and finish introducing yourself.
Hi, thank you for the intro. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so as she mentioned, my name is Elisa de la Paz. I'm a life coach and a yoga teacher currently studying neuroscience at Arizona State University. And for me, my journey has been an ongoing process of soulganizing. I find myself as I do consistent reflection and introspection that there's always areas of life that I can kind of step back and take that inventory needed. So it's also been a huge part of my coaching practice and what I offer for my clients. There was so many alignments with what I saw from your podcast that I also share with my clients to kind of help them get in alignment, because I think at the end of the day, when we listen to that inner voice and we allow the space for that, that's usually when on the other side we feel most fulfilled in life. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate what you're sharing.
Thanks. And so you would call what I would call the soul, you would call the inner voice.
Yeah, I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of alignment. Yeah, and it just depends on how you want to phrase it.
Yeah. And so, when did you first, on the opposite end of the spectrum, come in contact with your ego?
Yes. I would say, initially I had kind of a poor perspective towards ego. So the first time I became aware of it, there was a lot of noise about the ego is bad and it's not, you shouldn't feed your ego and things like that. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, in the beginning, a lot of the stories were kind of negative, and on my own journey of healing, I had to realize that it's essential. Our ego is an essential part of self, and integrating it and understanding how to not maybe be driven by it, but to allow
Mhm.
it to come in when it's necessary, and to balance all of the aspects of self. Ego is so prominent, and there is certainly spaces in which we may get taken over by it. And I think that's just part of understanding self, and that
Mhm.
when you're aware of it, that's the most prominent turning point. When you know it's happening, even if it happens again and again and again, you can be aware and check in and say, oh, I see this is coming up for me. And I notice that it's maybe in the driver's seat, and I want to get back in the driver's seat and not allow that to drive me. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I always use the term. I had a mantra for many years, and I still use it on occasion. And it was allowing my heart to be guided and allowing my ego to be guided by my heart.
Yes.
So I use the ego and the heart as like I check in with myself, and I'm like, am I being guided by my heart right now, or am I being guided by my ego? And I try to use that as a self-reflection tool.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome at your young age to be able to do that. Excuse me. So, when did you first become aware of the fact that you were partially an ego, right? A false sense of self that
Mm, yes.
conditioned into you as a child, right? As you're growing up, we usually develop one pretty quickly. So, what was your journey like?
Yeah, thank you for reiterating that. I noticed it first as a young adult, like, and I guess it would maybe even be like early teen years. So when I was becoming, um, I guess like just before puberty, I started to notice myself in a way that I hadn't before, and I
Mhm.
became maybe even a bit critical on like from my upbringing, and things that I heard, and like the way I was maybe treated and spoken to. I started to develop that voice towards myself, And of
Yes.
course, at the time, I didn't know what was happening, and I didn't realize all the layers of that type of internal dialogue. But with hindsight, I can see that that was maybe like for me 11, 12 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and I could hear it, and it was almost like there was I feel like the best way to describe it is there was this criticism,
Yeah.
and I was always checking in with myself and noticing, like, why do I show up this way, or why do I behave this way, and what's going on? And I asked that question for over 10 years. I ask that question even today. But
Yeah.
then I felt a little debilitated by the question because I didn't have the tools or the mentorship to understand myself.
Yeah. Well said. It is a separate voice, and it's a voice that we only can have because we were taught it. It's not something that, you're born with.
Right.
And the ego is definitely a false sense of self. It's our preferences and our criticisms, right? It's the thing that starts to criticize you.
Mm.
And we only know to criticize ourselves because we watch other people criticize themselves or they criticize us. And so, was that a prevalent thing that you experienced in your childhood?
Oh yeah, for sure. I always refer to this, I was the baby growing up. I was the
Mm.
youngest.
Me
So
too.
yeah, in a sense, I see in, with hindsight that I was kind of an easy target, is how I would say it. And
Mhm.
I also had a lot of older cousins too. So I had two siblings growing up, and then also like many other cousins, and we
Yes.
would always all be together. And I feel like because I was the smallest, I was just easier to pick on.
Yeah.
And that happened very often. And it's common in my family to use this, that might be how like we learn to communicate or to even love each other, which is a whole other distortion, right?
Yeah.
So I had to kind of become aware of all of those elements in my childhood and realize, how do I want to pave the way for myself, and then how do I want to teach my children one day? And that was where my journey turned to my inner child work, and that was a huge process in my healing.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, I same thing. I was the youngest of all my cousins, and absolutely an easy target just for teasing or what have you. But and also if it's just the way the family is, right? And then the ego takes on the voice for itself and says, okay, I know how to do this. I survive by criticizing myself, by consistently like looking at myself and figuring out what I could do better.
Hmm.
And sometimes that's really helpful and can make us successful.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, did it make you successful in any way, or did it really debilitate you, or how did that go?
I definitely took the high road on that
Yeah.
one. I
Yeah.
used it as fuel, and I mean, I think the biggest step I took earlier in life was I joined the Marines, and
Wow.
that was a huge transition from kind of being that baby, so to speak, and then
Mhm.
stepping out and like taking control of my future and my path. And throughout my time in service, I was obviously, the service is very male oriented. There's a lot of men in the service. So I was
Probably
always
pretty
around
ego-based.
I was always around men, and then I would maybe over assert myself, and I felt like I needed to
Mm.
prove something, and I was always trying to go the extra mile in order to show up in a way that I could be competitive in terms of promotion and things like this. So it
Wow.
was really the fire that got me to where I wanted to be, and I was extremely successful in the military. So I see it as a blessing. And I think that's important when we understand our past, that we see the elements of our shadow as gifts. And it's really up to us to alchemize that pain, and not allow the ego to drive that pain, but instead to turn it into something positive.
Yeah, and then sometimes it can definitely start you on a path of positivity, right? Like you said, you went into the Marines and you owned more of your sense of self. And
Hmm.
clearly the military is gotta be ego-based,
Yeah.
right? So it probably inflated you a little bit more to think like, yeah, I can do whatever the heck I want. I'm confident. I can do these things. I can move through the ranks of even men. And then when you got out of the military, how did your ego continue to work you to the bone?
Yeah, I went straight into entrepreneurship, and it was the the atmosphere I found myself in was very similar in terms of go, go, go all the time. There's
Mm.
always something that needs to be done. There's a task at hand. And again, I was very successful. I picked it up very quickly, and I was fortunate to have my grandfather growing up as an entrepreneur, so I always got to witness him as well. And I'm thankful for that, and I loved the journey that I was on. But again, like you said, it was still very ego driven, and I was
Mm.
very in like enthralled by the material world. And I
Yeah.
could sense that that was really what took me where I wanted to be, because I was thinking like, okay, how can I be successful, or how can I show up and be validated for what I'm doing?
Yeah. And so at what point did this not start to be fun anymore? When did it start causing you suffering? When we were like, okay, this got me here, but it's not going to work anymore.
Yeah, I would say the best way to put it is the body keeps the score. And that's one of my favorite books. And it's also
Yeah.
one of my favorite phrases, because it is so true. Even if you don't listen to that inner voice I mentioned, and there have been phases of my life where I completely ignored it. And this was one of them. And it was after being in entrepreneurship for about a year and a half, and I had two thriving businesses, and my body started to speak to me in a way that I was losing weight. I was having like chest pains, and I couldn't understand like
Mm.
if it was from like some I had a heart condition, or if it was just stress. I didn't know what was happening. And of course, after going to the doctor and everything, it came down to just being like stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
So and I had the voice, I heard it, and I just didn't listen to it. And eventually my body started to tell me, like, you have to slow down. And I made quite a drastic decision at that point, and I decided to just, leave my businesses behind and go on a sabbatical and really sit with all of the things that were surfacing for me emotionally that I had just kind of pushed under the rug. I gave myself the space to finally be present and just feel my emotions.
Wow. So you said, I heard the voice. Did you mean you heard your soul whispering to you?
Yes, before my body started to kind of push me over the edge, there
Yeah.
was that internal experience of like hearing, okay, that like I needed to slow down, or I needed to shift directions, or there was just some intuition I had that I didn't listen to. And
Hmm.
that was the first layer. And then after not listening to that, my body began to
Yeah.
be show up in a way that was like, okay, you're going to listen now.
Yeah. I think that is really what happens. I mean, I don't want to sound controversial, but I do believe that our bodies are like the last part of the manifestation of what
Mhm.
not listening, right? It's like, okay, well, if you're not going to listen, then it's going to show up physically. And I'm glad you caught it early enough. And you made a drastic change, right? You listened and made a change.
Yeah.
And you went traveling.
Yeah.
And I would encourage anyone to look at your website just for the frickin' pictures. At one point, she's walking with a lion. I
Yeah.
thought, how did that happen? So yeah, you're not kidding. You really trusted your soul and went on quite a journey. What was that like to start, listening to that?
Yeah, it was quite liberating. Um, I found that there's a lot of ease and flow to life,
Yes.
and it doesn't have to be complicated. And I shifted in that space of there was a lot of healing, so there was a lot of tears, and there was a lot of pain, and there was so much happening on one level that was really what I was having to sit with. But on another level, there was this flow that I was able to enter, where I realized I didn't need to I guess strain. Like there was a lot of strain in the way I was approaching life before, and feeling like I
Yeah.
needed to pursue and I needed to go after things. But
Mhm.
once I made this transition, and I didn't mention, but I moved to an island called Zanzibar.
Yeah.
And when I was there, that's where I discovered this like flow that I could live in with there's no resistance. When you're listening to that internal voice and you're allowing that to guide you and you're trusting it, you will walk through all the doors of opportunity, and you will everything is kind of is laid out for you if you trust in that and you follow it. And that was the transition for me, where now, even as I'm pursuing my degree and I'm continuing my business, I'm realizing that I don't have to fight for it. I don't have to strain
Yes.
to get
Yes.
anywhere. And now when I come up against resistance, I immediately step back and I'm like, that's maybe just not for me. There's
Gosh.
something for me and it doesn't
Yeah.
require the strain.
Yeah, such a wonderful discernment between the ego and the soul, right? The soul feels liberating. It feels like flow. It trusts, you can trust the process, as you've said before we started recording, right? You can trust this process. And it's just so foreign to so many people,
Mm,
especially at my age. And I'm really hoping that the younger generation gets this, not listen to us. But you did, and then you said, and now I can really discern when if there's any level of strain, I just step back. So
mhm,
before, strain felt normal, strain felt like what you're supposed to do, criticism felt like, yeah, this is how it goes, right? And
mhm,
now, because you spend enough time soul searching, literally, um, you're able to discern immediately. And that's the thing about the ego. It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away, but it will show up and you will feel it. It'll be like, oh, that's just disturbed my peace. Ugh. And
yeah,
maybe like to your point, sometimes it can be helpful, right? Like to know where to put food and to,
mm,
understand your age and like where you are in like the general sense of life. And
right.
I mean, like the ego, like you said, it can be integrated into that. But the first step is to recognize the ego will make you feel strained or constricted in some level and say, okay, okay, like settle. Like if we're not going to stress out ego, what else can we do to support you? Right? Like you want something, let's do it, from a heart-based perspective, like you said. So I love that you're already figuring that out or figured it out, so that now you're going into something that to me seems very, traditional, like neuroscience. And
Mm.
I'm curious to how like you went from yoga and mindfulness to I want to understand the science behind all this. How did that happen?
I'm glad you asked that actually. As I was on my sabbatical, Zanzibar took me up to Egypt and I spent a few months there. And then I finally felt like I got this call back home. So I knew I was ready
Mm.
to come back to the States after a few years of living in Africa. And part of that call was this needing the balance and grounding. So on my sabbatical that lasted nearly a year, I was floating and I loved it. It was
Mhm.
amazing. And I was as woo-woo as it gets, I was there. And I loved it. It was such a beautiful time for me, but I
Yeah.
could sense that something was not balanced in me. And I
Mm.
knew that if I integrated hard science into all of that experience that I had, and I often say I can speak to the scientist and the hippie. Like that's
Yeah.
the vision. That's what I really
Yeah.
want to be able to do. And that's
Yeah.
part of my reason for pursuing this degree because I want to integrate it within myself, but I also want to widen my audience.
Yeah, and I think that each one of us should do that. Each one of us should balance out the hippiness, like, in us and the science, because they both matter. And, I often think of like myself as like a kite flying, and like I'm just, when I'm off in my spiritual pursuits and breath work, and like I don't want to come back,
Right.
but like the creator put us on this earth to make some real physical changes. And we've decided as a society that science is that
Mm,
method, right? And so I love that you got to have such a grounded, embodied experience of your soul
mm,
so that you can pursue the physical needs of the planet right now and the physical needs of the people who are overwhelmed by their egos.
mm.
So thank you for doing that. I appreciate you studying.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. So where is this journey going to take you, do you think, to go back and work with clients more
Mm.
specifically? I know you're working with some of them now, but my guess is that you hope to do even more work when you're not studying all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
certainly. So short term, I want to build mindfulness curriculum for the classroom,
Oh,
ideally K
wonderful.
through 12.
Oh, please. Please.
Yeah, this is a big passion of mine. I mean, I think just transmitting mindfulness generally is something that I feel passionate about sharing with my clients.
Mhm.
But if we can integrate it into an already existing system, I think it's can be very powerful for our
Mm,
students, especially in just being able to
mm.
introduce the concept early on. Um,
Yes.
so that's my short term. And then long term, I would like to build a school in Africa. This is something
Oh,
that I also feel very passionate about, having lived there for many years and just really I spent time in the village, and I often, found myself just completely in awe, of the community and the people and just how loving and giving they are,
mm,
yet they don't have much. They even if it was their last slice of bread, they would give it away, and that to
wow.
me, the values of that level of community is something that I didn't get to experience so much coming up in the West, and I
Yeah.
feel very attached to that.
Yeah, I would say the West is very much take, right? It's
Mhm.
more of a take and keep mentality, like make sure you get what's yours, and it's a very much and then become a really good consumer. Yeah.
Right.
And so if you were to build, on what you're learning and take that to a whole nother country where you've already seen they have less ego, they're
Mhm.
more in touch with their soul and their human to human connection.
Yeah.
How do you see yourself integrating that with both your clients and maybe within a community that's like that?
Mm. Integrating what exactly? I just wanna clarify the question.
Like integrating the fact that, you would be approaching people who are already
Mm.
very soul-based,
Ah,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great because I actually feel more inclined in that environment to introduce these things, whether it's mindfulness or even just
Mm,
any type of structured curriculum that I hope to introduce. I feel that they would take better to it because in
mm.
the West, we're more programmed. And even the schooling system, in my opinion, which I do have beef with,
Yeah,
there's this like get in line, and
yeah,
then you're boxed in at such an early age that you don't get space for creativity and exploration, that you dim some of your light, in my opinion, in the education system in the West.
yeah,
Whereas in Africa and so many places, they haven't had so much influx of like
yeah.
programming and do it this way or don't do it that way. So I feel even that I would like to have some type of research lab incorporated
Mm,
in the school so that we
wow.
can track how well they're taking to some of this and see what are the differences between this community, as you mentioned, that's more connected, whether it's to themselves or to the earth or to their community, and just comparing what does that look like for them to receive the same curriculum, for example.
Mm. So if you were gonna marry those people, quote unquote, as the hippies to the science, how do you think that would enhance their lives? You were there. You were there. You saw them give you their last piece of bread, but you want to bring something more modern, I think, to them.
Right, exactly.
How
I
would
think
that, yeah, look for you?
Yeah, I think it would certainly bring a new light into the picture for them. I think in a lot of ways, they don't always have access, for example, to education. So I
Mhm.
think in that regard, it can be very expansive, right? If
Yeah.
the knowledge and information that they're receiving and finally receiving, because unfortunately they're so behind the curve, that would be redefining society, right? And like, what are we expecting to create? In the West, we already have so many ideas of what we're supposed to be, whereas there's some communities that are untainted, so to speak, and being
Mhm.
able to reach them and prioritize things like compassion or mindfulness and allowing that to be the introduction for them of knowledge and information, that can be so powerful, and using
Mm.
that to our advantage so that we're not prioritizing things like the ego and feeding the ego with our pursuits.
Yeah. So a non-egoic education, right? Because again, we're still going to use education and science as ways to move forward and evolve as humans. And I can't remember the movie that I watched, but I just recently watched a movie. It was a true story about a kid, and I believe he was in somewhere in Africa, and he had taken the last bike from his village or his parents to create a windmill that would run and bring up the water. And
Mm.
that wasn't his ego, that was his soul. And that was his soul using basic materials. And he ended up getting a scholarship to MIT, I believe. It's an amazing story, and I'm
Oh,
sorry I
wow.
don't know that, but that's kind of what I'm hearing you say is like there's these beautiful people that are super loving and super caring that would give you their last thing of bread, and it's like, well, let's give them the tools to have like whatever they need physically in these areas, and maybe try to do it without coming in and telling them what to do and bringing in a big ego and making a like a big brick and mortar maybe that's got fluorescent lights. You're talking about doing something much more compassionate and beautiful for them, who are already great evolved souls, but could, just like you said, haven't necessarily been exposed to
Hmm.
this and what that could mean for their communities, so that they're not suffering, because there's real physical suffering sometimes that is nothing to do with the ego, right?
Right.
But the ego in the movie, the father was sort of against, you know, being a part of moving forward in that way. And
Mm.
this kid took a big leap of trust to do that. And it's a really beautiful movie. And I'm sorry, I don't know the name, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm hearing you say that you want to do, and that is a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So in the meantime, how do you work with your current clients? Like, who do you like to work with if somebody is listening to this and maybe wants to contact you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for asking. So my website is relaxwithelisa.com, and my social media is also relaxwithelisa. And I usually prefer to I'm very open, but I really prefer when clients are in a transition phase. I find that there's so much value we can extract, whether it's moving to a new location or um, finding a new job, transitioning in terms of career or life, whatever it is. I find transition to be such a valuable space because we're so open. We're so much more
Yeah.
open in the midst of that. So that's usually, something that I feel like I can extract the most value when we're in transition.
Hmm.
And also, I also have like the way I set up my business, I was quite nomadic at the time, so I've made it to where I can do everything online.
Mm,
So most of my clients I like to have via Zoom just because I can reach anyone anywhere, which is so powerful.
yeah.
So it is. It's not specific to my location, and even my yoga is also something I can do remote. So that
Wow.
is something I've done mostly in my community here in Phoenix, Arizona. But again, I set up my business so that I could reach any audience anywhere.
Wow. So a good client for you would be someone who has maybe heard the word mindfulness,
Hmm.
maybe heard the words life coach and is like, I might check this out.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
and then that might also be open to being taught through the body, through yoga,
Hmm.
right? But that maybe, you could work with somebody who is an entrepreneur who's like, I don't want to look at me closing my doors as a failure, but rather a transition to move into the more powerful parts of my life. Like I had that experience and that was fine, but it's not fulfilling me. Like you said, if anything, it's causing me strain and maybe some heart issues,
Yeah.
stress issues. So someone like that would be good for you. And just anybody, you said anywhere in the world, right? They can work with
Yeah.
you. So it doesn't have to be in Arizona, but you are in Arizona,
Yeah.
and everybody's listening and wants to find you. Awesome. So thank you so much for being here. And it's Relax with Eliza, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And seriously just go to her website if you want to feel relaxed, because I will say that much of I was just like, wow, like all of your pictures and the traveling and just the beauty on your face. Like you can generally tell how happy you were to be in Africa and to have those experiences. And I imagine that you brought that home, and your presence right now, if people are not seeing your face, like you look really relaxed. So I really feel like people who maybe are stressed out and need to relax You'd
Come
be a
on
good
over.
person, yeah, for mindfulness or transitioning or yoga or whatever. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so and last question, when are you gonna finish your, when are you projected to finish your degree?
May 2026.
Okay. All right, well, good luck with that.
Yeah, thank
I love
you.
what you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, have a great rest of your day.
Bye.